Welcome to your Introduction to Ethics course. This is an overview of Unit 1, Embracing Ethics. In this unit, we'll ask ourselves roughly what ethics is. So what is ethics? Well, part of ethics is going to be ethical thinking. On the other hand, there are many ways in which people avoid ethics and ethical thinking, and we'll talk about these. And at the end of the day, we'll talk also about how to take values seriously, which is roughly what ethics is about. So what does it take to behave ethically? Is raking your neighbor's lawn for some money enough? Is cleaning up the river because your parents said so enough? Not really. Don't get me wrong. Those things are good things to do. But to behave ethically is going to take a little more than that. Not only the doing good, but also thinking about it and having good reasons for doing it. Here's Weston's definition of ethics. He says that to think and act ethically is to take care for the basic needs and legitimate expectations of others as well as our own. There is a lot in that definition, and Weston, in your book, takes the time to explain each of those elements. I won't do that here, but I want to draw your attention on something. That definition actually raises more questions, further questions. Who are others? Who counts as others? Do animals do? What are basic needs? Is it to have enough food to survive or to have choices about what to eat? What are legitimate expectations? Is it that you have your right of property? Or is it that you have health care? Or is it that you have education? Those are open questions at this point. And in fact, they are ethical questions. They are questions that ethics and ethical thinking are dealing with. Now you may wonder, well, do these questions ever have any answers at all? They don't have single easy answers, I'll grant you that. But the point of ethics is precisely to show that there are better or worse answers because of the reasons that are behind those answers. So in ethics, we have to give reasons for what we believe, and we can assess those reasons. And that assessment is what ethical thinking is about. What I'm trying to say here is that ethical thinking is part and parcel of ethical behavior. So the first point we wanted to draw here is that true ethical behavior is not only doing and ethical doing, but it's also thinking, ethical thinking. Now, what is ethical thinking? Well, if you want to have a sense of what it is basically to use your thoughts and your thinking tools such that you avoid having your average fruitless debate about very complicated and thorny issues, but instead you manage to have a respectful and productive discussion. Now, how do you do that when the issues are so complex, so emotionally laden, and so thorny? Well, we'll talk about that more next week in the next unit. But for now, we'll go very quickly in the material for this unit over a few of the characters of ethical thinking. That ethical thinking is systematic, that is, it looks at all the options and the reasons behind them and the consequence that lay in front of them. It is critical in the sense that it evaluates the reasons behind those answers with a critical mind. And then it's creative. That is, it is trying to get out of the deadlocks that are characteristics of many ethical debates. Let me try to explain a little bit more about this. Again, most of the issues, the complex issues we're going to talk about, can have different answers, plausible, acceptable answers. Now we want to look at all of these. We're not going to get stuck in only one possible answers. So we'll look at all these answers. But this is not to say that we consider that all these answers are equally valid. Quite the opposite. What we do in philosophy and ethics is to look into the reasons that lie behind each of these answers. Once we have laid out all of those reasons, then we can apply critical thinking in order to evaluate these reasons. And in turn, as a consequence, we can evaluate those answers. The better the reasons, the better the answers. The worse the reasons, the worse the answer. Now let's think by contrast. By contrast to proper ethical thinking, what are the ways in which people don't think ethically, avoid thinking ethically? Well, there are many of them. It's actually more common than the other way around. So Weston will talk about many of them. Some of them are flying by instinct, which is basically that to say that what your guts tell you is right. Egoism, which is to say that what you should be doing is to just look for yourself. Dogmatism, which is to say that whatever you're believing, strongly believing, must be right just because you believe it. And relativism, which is just as insidious as dogmatism is, and which is the view according to which all views are equally valid. One interesting way to think about the ethics avoidance disorders, as Weston calls them, is to think in terms of a distinction that those views usually fail to, the distinction that they fail to make. And that is a distinction between what is descriptive and what is prescriptive. When you make a description of something, you explain the way things are. When you make a prescription, then you explain the way things should be. Now, interestingly, most of the ethics avoidance disorders can be explained in that way. Egoism, for example, is going from the claim that people are sometimes or always selfish, that is a descriptive claim, to a prescriptive claim, which is that people should be selfish. Flying by instinct can be seen as in a similar way. On the descriptive side, people say, this is the way I feel, and that is true. There's no denying that the feeling is real. But from that reality, that fact of a feeling, it doesn't follow that this is the way you ought to feel. Feelings are always true, but they're not always justified. And suddenly, we don't want to act on them all the time. Similarly, again, dogmatism goes from a claim, which is a descriptive claim about what you believe, this is what I believe, to a prescriptive claim, which is, this is what I ought to believe. Again, this simply doesn't follow. Here's the last example. Relativism goes from a descriptive claim, which is that people tend to disagree about ethical issues, to a prescriptive claim, which is that people ought to disagree, and we should take that disagreement as a proof of the equal validity of all claims. All right, so let us sum up what we've been talking about up to now. We've been talking about the fact that to behave ethically is not only some doing, it's also some ethical thinking. We've been trying to say roughly what ethical thinking consists in, and also characterizing it by contrast to the different ways in which people avoid thinking ethically. Now, the rigorous thinking we're talking about, the rigorous, systematic, and creative thinking we're talking about applies to a very specific content, which is ethical content. Ethical issues are difficult. Ethical issues involve values. So ethical thinking necessarily involves taking values seriously. Now you might wonder, what are values? And we'll cover that during this unit. We also talk about families of values and the way in which it is very useful to characterize values along with families. So what are values? Well, we all have examples in mind. Weston gives you a definition, those things we care about that matter to us, those goals and ideals we aspire to and measure ourselves or others or our society by. Those are norms, right? Those are things that we are trying to reach, that we expect ourselves to try to attain, and also that we expect others to try to reach. Now, which values are we going to take into account when thinking about an issue? Obviously, there are many of them, and it can be overwhelming. Well, one way in which ethical thinking is very useful is by mapping out issues. That is to say, to look at the different answers that people give to a certain issue and to understand them in terms of families of values. Families, the idea is that values cluster into roughly four families. The family of persons. This is where people think about individual right. They talk about respect for the individual and for its individual freedom. The ethics of happiness has a very different perspective. This is about how much happiness or utility you can bring into the world as a consequence of your action. The ethics of virtue is another set of values that are oftentimes appealed to. This is about the kind of person you want to be, whether you have courage, whether you are honest, the kind of character that you are. And finally, there is the family of relationships. And that is about the kind of responsibility that you have because of the relationships you enter in. So you have relationships with your parents, with your children, with your community, maybe with the earth. And because of those various relationships, you have some kind of responsibility and duty to take care of the people or the things that you are related to. Now, again, what's interesting here is that by classifying or by grouping different values under those big upper second order families, what happens is that we can find systematic ways in which those families conflict with one another. And we can understand some views, some conflicts in terms of those families. So think about you debating whether you should tell your best friend that her partner has been cheating on her. Well, what should you do? Well, you can find yourself in a kind of a dialogue between two views. One which tells you owe the truth to your best friend because you respect her, and she's your best friend. She is a full human being. You should respect her for being a rational being. She needs to know the truth. On the other hand, you can find yourself thinking, but look, this is going to make her miserable, and it's not clear that this is going to bring any good to the situation. She might as well remain totally oblivious to the cheating because it was just a one-time thing, and after all, this relationship is so more valuable than this just one-time thing. That kind of thinking in terms of whether the consequences of your actions bring more happiness or not, or good or not in terms of consequences, and the kind of principled view about respect for individuals is a classic way in which values clashes. Now, by looking at families of value, you understand that this is about putting different colored glasses. You put this color on the situation, and you see people who are to whom you owe some respect. You take the other color glasses, and then you realize that the kind of consequences of your actions count as well. Now you understand how those two views can conflict for the same situation when you understand that they come from very different perspectives on ethics. Now we'll talk more about all of this. In fact, all of these correspond to a specific theory of ethics, to which Unit 3 will be entirely devoted. But for now, this is just a way for you to understand that we can try to systematize issues, to mapping out issues, to understand why there is a conflict and where this conflict is coming from. I already talked too much, so let me conclude. In this class, we'll talk about ethics. In this unit, we'll try to understand what it means to behave ethically and to think ethically. Well, to behave ethically is to address some hard questions. It's not to avoid those questions, but actually to tackle them with some rigorous and hard thinking. And at the end of the day, hopefully, that hard thinking on those hard questions produces some careful and carefully thought through answers. Now, one word about the discussion this week, and that will be the end of this video. The discussions this week will be about trying to understand what it is to do ethics. The first one is really about introducing ourselves and telling each other what kind of expectation we have for the course. The second one is more related to the material. It's about ethical transformation. What does it take to change your mind on an ethical issue? I'll ask you to think about concrete example in your own life about what it took for you to see the other side and to be more flexible on a certain issue. The third discussion board will be about value identification, and again work on this notion of flexibility of the mind in ethics. The point will be to look at a piece, a very classic piece, even if it's recent, which is the conservative defense of gay marriage. It will not be about whether gay marriage is morally acceptable or not. It will be about understanding how conservative values, classically taken to be conservative values, can be used in order to defend the gay marriage. In the final section, what we'll talk about is about food choices, in particular the treatment of animals. We'll look seriously at that question about what kind of justification we have for treating the animals like we do in the food industry. Again, what I want you to do in all of those discussion boards is to remain respectful, to think hard, to be open-minded without being a relativist, but really to tackle those issues with an honest, genuine, rigorous thinking. All right, I hope we have a good week. Bye-bye.